Margaret Whitmore sat on a wooden bench in the park, enjoying the gentle afternoon breeze. The sun was warm but not too harsh, and the laughter of children filled the air. She liked coming here. It gave her a sense of peace. At her age, life had slowed down, and she often found herself lost in memories. Some were happy, some were painful, but all of them made up the life she had lived. As she watched the children playing, her eyes suddenly locked onto a young black boy running across the playground. He was no older than 6 or 7, his curly hair bouncing with every step. Something about him made Margaret sit up straight. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she felt as if she had been pulled back in time. The boy reminded her of someone she knew very well. His bright, curious eyes, the way he smiled, even the way he moved. It was all too familiar. It was almost as if she was looking at her son, William, when he was that age. But that was impossible. William was now a grown man, a billionaire businessman who rarely had time to visit her. And this child, he was different. Yet, the resemblance was too strong to ignore. Margaret tried to shake off the feeling, but her eyes kept following the boy. He was playing with a small, worn-out toy car, pushing it along the edge of the bench where she sat. Every now and then, he would glance up at her, as if he could feel her gaze. "Hi," the boy suddenly said, his voice cheerful and full of life. Margaret smiled warmly. "Hello there. What's your name?" "Malik," he replied proudly. "That's a lovely name," she said. "You remind me of someone very dear to me." Malik grinned, clearly enjoying the conversation. "Who?" Margaret hesitated. She didn't know how to explain it. She couldn't just say, "You look exactly like my son when he was your age." That would sound strange. Instead, she simply said, "Someone very special from my past." Just then, a woman walked up, wiping her hands on a napkin. She had the same warm brown eyes as Malik and an air of quiet strength. "Malik, sweetheart, don't disturb the nice lady." "Oh, he's not disturbing me at all," Margaret assured her. "He's a delightful boy." The woman smiled. "Thank you. I'm Tanya, Malik's mother." Margaret extended her hand, and Tanya shook it firmly. As they spoke, Margaret couldn't stop herself from glancing at Malik. The questions in her mind only grew louder. Who was this boy? Why did he look so much like William? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more? Something she had never known. As Tanya and Malik walked away, Margaret sat still, her heart heavy with a strange mix of emotions. She needed to know the truth. That night, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the boy she had met in the park. Malik. His name echoed in her mind, along with the way he smiled, the way he looked at her with those familiar eyes. It wasn't just a small resemblance. He truly looked like William when he was a child. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, staring at the city lights outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for an old photo album on the table beside her. Slowly, she flipped through the pages, stopping at a picture of William when he was about Malik's age. His face was bright with laughter, his curls slightly messy from playing outside. Margaret traced the image with her fingers, feeling a deep sense of nostalgia. The past had never fully left her. There were moments she had tried to forget, things she had buried deep inside. But now, those memories were coming back, knocking on the door of her heart, refusing to be ignored. She thought about the time when she was young, struggling to raise William on her own. It had not been easy. She had worked long hours, barely making enough to give him the life he deserved. But she had done her best, sacrificing everything to ensure her son had a bright future. However, there was a part of her past that she rarely spoke about. A time before William was born, a time filled with choices she never thought would come back to haunt her. She remembered a man, someone she had cared about deeply. It had been a different world back then, one that didn't always accept love in all its forms. She had been forced to walk away, forced to make decisions she hadn't fully understood at the time. Could it be possible that she had missed something? Could there be a truth she had never known? The thought made her heart race. If Malik was connected to her family, how? Margaret took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, but something inside her told her otherwise. The feeling was too strong to ignore. She knew there was only one way to find out. She had to learn more about Malik and his mother, Tanya. Who were they? Where did they come from? And most importantly, was there any chance that Malik was truly connected to her son? Margaret closed the photo album and placed it back on the table. She had spent her whole life believing she knew everything about her past, but now, for the first time in years, she felt uncertain. There was a mystery in front of her, one she couldn't turn away from. Tomorrow, she would go back to the park. She had to see Malik again. She had to know the truth. The next afternoon, Margaret returned to the park, her heart beating faster than usual. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she had to see Malik again. She sat on the same bench as before, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes scanning the playground. Minutes passed, and just as she started to feel disappointed, she saw him. Malik was playing with his toy car again, rolling it over the pavement with a big smile on his face. His laughter rang through the air, full of innocence and joy. Margaret's heart softened. She had spent all night thinking about him, wondering if she was just imagining things. But now, looking at him again, she knew she wasn't. The resemblance to her son, William, was too strong to ignore. Before she could say anything, Tanya appeared, carrying a small paper bag in one hand. She spotted Margaret and smiled. Back again. Margaret nodded. Yes, it's such a beautiful day. I enjoy the fresh air. Tanya sat down beside her, placing the bag on her lap. Me too. Malik loves this park. I try to bring him here whenever I can. Margaret hesitated for a moment before speaking. He's a wonderful boy, she said sincerely. You must be very proud of him. Tanya's face lit up with warmth. I am. He's my everything. She pulled out a sandwich from the bag and handed it to Malik, who ran over to take it. Say thank you, sweetheart. Thank you, Mommy, Malik said cheerfully before running back to play. Margaret watched the boy, her thoughts racing. She wanted to ask so many questions, but she didn't know where to start. Instead, she chose her words carefully. If you don't mind me asking, do you have a big family? Tanya sighed softly. Not really. It's just me and Malik now. My parents passed away a few years ago, and Malik's father, well, he's not in the picture. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to raise a child alone. That must be tough, she said gently. Tanya nodded but smiled. It is, but I wouldn't change a thing. Malik is my greatest blessing. Margaret's mind was spinning. If Malik's father wasn't around, was it possible he had a connection to her family? She wanted to ask more, but she didn't want to be intrusive. She needed to be careful. I hope you don't mind me saying this, Margaret said slowly, but Malik reminds me so much of someone I know. Tanya raised an eyebrow. Really? Who? Margaret hesitated, unsure if she should reveal the truth just yet. Someone from my past, she said softly. Tanya looked curious but didn't press further. Instead, she glanced at her son, watching him play. Well, maybe it's just a coincidence, she said with a smile. Margaret nodded, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. She had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room, staring at the flickering candle on the table. Her mind was restless. No matter how much she tried, she couldn't push the thoughts away. The resemblance between Malik and her son, William, was too strong to be ignored. It wasn't just the way he looked. It was in his smile, his curious eyes, even the way he moved. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that there had to be a connection. She got up and walked to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened the drawer and pulled out a small box filled with old photographs and letters. She hadn't looked through them in years, but tonight, she needed answers. As she flipped through the pictures, Her hands trembled slightly. There were photos of William as a baby, then as a little boy playing in the backyard. She stopped at one particular picture, William at 6 years old, sitting on a swing, smiling at the camera. Her breath caught in her throat. The image of Malik flashed in her mind. They could have been twins. Tears pricked her eyes. Had she missed something all these years? Had there been a truth hidden from her that she had never known? Her mind drifted back to her past. She thought about her younger days, about the struggles she had faced as a single mother. Raising William alone had not been easy, but she had done everything she could to give him a good life. But before William was born, there had been another chapter in her life, one she rarely spoke about. She had been young and in love. It was a love that had been filled with joy, but also pain. The relationship had ended, not by choice, but by circumstances she couldn't control. It was a time she had tried to forget, but now it all came rushing back. Could it be possible that there was more to that story than she had ever realized? Could Malik somehow be connected to the past she had left behind? Margaret felt her heart racing. She needed to know more. She needed to find out about Malik's father. Tanya had said he wasn't in the picture, but who was he? Had he ever been part of their lives? And most importantly, was there any chance he had a connection to William? She knew she couldn't just come out and ask Tanya such personal questions. She had to be careful. If she pushed too hard, Tanya might shut her out. And Margaret didn't want to lose the chance to uncover the truth. Sitting back in her chair, she took a deep breath. She would go to the park again tomorrow. She would talk to Tanya, spend more time with Malik, and try to learn more about their lives. She had to know, before it was too late. As she blew out the candle, the room fell into darkness. But in her heart, a light had been lit, the light of curiosity, of hope, and of a truth that was waiting to be discovered. The next morning, Margaret woke up with a strong determination in her heart. She had spent the whole night thinking about Malik, about William, and about the possibility that there was a missing piece in her life, one she had never even known existed. After getting dressed, she made her way to the park again, hoping to find Tanya and Malik. She wasn't sure how she would bring up the topic, but she knew she had to try. The truth was too important to ignore. When she arrived, she saw Malik playing near the swings while Tanya sat on a bench, watching him with a smile. Margaret took a deep breath and walked over. "Good morning, Tanya," she greeted warmly. Tanya looked up and smiled. "Oh, good morning, Margaret. Back again?" Margaret chuckled softly. "Yes, I suppose I enjoy the fresh air. And it's always a joy to see Malik having fun." Tanya nodded. "He loves it here. It's his favorite place." For a moment, they sat in silence, watching Malik run around. Then Margaret decided to take a chance. She turned to Tanya and said gently, "Tanya, I hope you don't mind me asking, but you mentioned yesterday that Malik's father isn't in the picture. May I ask, do you know anything about him?" Tanya sighed, her expression turning serious. "I do," she admitted, "but it's complicated." Margaret listened carefully, not wanting to push too hard. "I understand," she said softly. "I don't mean to bring up anything painful. I can't shake this feeling that I know Malik from somewhere. He reminds me so much of someone from my life." Tanya looked surprised. "Really? Who?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before finally saying it. "My son, William." Tanya's eyes widened. "William Whitmore, the businessman." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes. When I first saw Malik, it was like looking at William when he was a child. The resemblance is uncanny." Tanya was quiet for a long time. Then she took a deep breath and said, "I never met Malik's father. I only know his name, David." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The name sent a wave of memories crashing over her. She whispered, almost in disbelief, "David." Tanya nodded. "My mother told me about him before she passed away. She said he never knew about me, never knew about Malik. It was a complicated situation, and my mom chose to raise me alone. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. David, the man she had once loved. The man her family had forced her to leave behind all those years ago. Could it be? Was Malik, William's half-brother? Margaret's mind spun with possibilities. There was only one way to know for sure. A DNA test. But how would she ask for one? And what if the truth changed everything? Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The name David kept echoing in her mind. It was a name she had not spoken in years, yet now it felt as if the past had come knocking on her door, demanding to be seen. Could it really be true? Could Malik be connected to her family in a way she never imagined? She knew there was only one way to find out. A DNA test. But the thought of bringing it up to Tanya made her nervous. How would she react? Would she think Margaret was overstepping? Would she be offended? Margaret didn't want to ruin the fragile trust that was growing between them. The next day, she returned to the park as usual, her heart heavy with anticipation. She found Tanya sitting alone on the bench while Malik played with his toy car nearby. Margaret took a deep breath and approached her. "Tanya, can I speak to you for a moment?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle. Tanya looked up and smiled. "Of course. Is everything okay?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before deciding to be honest. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me yesterday about Malik's father. And I need to ask you something that may sound strange." Tanya's smile faded slightly, and she sat up straighter. "Go on." Margaret sighed, trying to find the right words. "I loved someone a long time ago. His name was David. We were very close, but we were separated by circumstances beyond our control. I never saw him again. Now, after meeting Malik, I can't ignore the possibility that he might be connected to my family." Tanya's eyes widened in surprise. "You think Malik might be related to you?" Margaret nodded. "I know it sounds unbelievable, but the resemblance is too strong to ignore. And if your mother told you that Malik's father never knew about you, what if David never knew he had another child? What if William and Malik are brothers?" Tanya looked down, deep in thought. It was clear that she was processing everything Margaret had said. Finally, she took a deep breath and met Margaret's gaze. "So, what are you suggesting?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before saying, "A DNA test. I don't want to pressure you, but I believe it's the only way to know the truth." Tanya remained silent, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she nodded slowly. "I'll admit, I never expected something like this, but if there's even a small chance that Malik has family out there, I owe it to him to find out." Margaret felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Tanya. No matter what the results are, I promise I will always respect your decision." Tanya gave her a small, nervous smile. "I guess we'll soon know the truth." Margaret nodded, but deep inside, she knew this truth could change all their lives forever. A week had passed since Margaret and Tanya had agreed to do the DNA test. Every day felt longer than usual, filled with anticipation, hope, and fear. Margaret tried to keep herself busy, but no matter what she did, her thoughts always returned to one thing: the results. She often found herself staring at the old photos of William as a child, comparing them to Malik in her mind. If the test confirmed her suspicions, it would mean that Malik was William's brother. The thought filled her with emotions she couldn't quite explain. Joy, sadness, regret, and hope, all mixed together. Tanya, too, seemed nervous. She hadn't spoken much about the test since they had taken Malik to the clinic for a simple cheek swab. Margaret could tell that, deep down, Tanya was just as anxious as she was. Finally, the day arrived. The results were ready. Tanya had agreed to meet Margaret at a small cafe near the park, a quiet place where they could talk without distractions. Margaret arrived first, her hands slightly shaking as she sipped her tea. A few minutes later, Tanya walked in, holding an envelope in her hand. She sat down across from Margaret, her face unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The envelope between them felt heavier than paper. It held the truth. Tanya took a deep breath. I haven't opened it yet. I wanted to do it here, with you. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. No matter what's inside, we'll face it together. Tanya swallowed hard, then carefully tore open the envelope. She pulled out the paper inside, her eyes scanning the words. Margaret watched as Tanya's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. A long silence filled the space between them. Then, Tanya looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. The results say, it's a match. Margaret felt as if the world had stopped. She blinked, trying to process the words. Malik is William's brother. Tanya nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Yes, that means your son and my son share the same father. Margaret covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the truth. She had always suspected it, but seeing it confirmed was something else entirely. Tanya wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't even know what to say. This changes everything. Margaret reached across the table, gently placing her hand over Tanya's. It changes things, yes, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. This means Malik has family. He has a brother. And you're not alone in this anymore. Tanya let out a shaky breath. But what about William? How do we tell him? Margaret's heart clenched at the thought. Would William accept Malik? Would he believe this story? Or would he push them away? One thing was certain. The biggest challenge was yet to come. Margaret sat in her living room, staring at the DNA test results on the table. The truth was now in front of her. Malik was William's brother. But one big question remained. How would William react? She had spent the past few days thinking about the best way to tell him. William was a billionaire, always busy with meetings, travels, and business deals. But more than that, he was a man who had lived his entire life believing he was an only child. How would he handle the truth? Would he accept Malik, or would he refuse to believe it? Margaret finally picked up her phone and dialed William's number. Her hands were slightly shaky as she waited for him to answer. Mom. William's deep voice came through the phone. Is everything okay? Margaret took a deep breath. William, I need to see you. There's something important I have to tell you. Can you come over? William was silent for a moment. Of course, Mom. I'll be there in an hour. Margaret exhaled, feeling both relieved and nervous. This was it. An hour later, William arrived. Tall, confident, and dressed in his usual expensive suit, he walked in and kissed Margaret on the cheek. You sounded serious on the phone. What's going on? Margaret gestured for him to sit. She hesitated for a moment, then handed him the DNA results. William, I need you to read this. William frowned but took the paper. As he scanned the document, his expression changed. His eyebrows furrowed, and he read the results twice before looking up. Mom, what is this? His voice was filled with confusion. Margaret swallowed hard. William, you have a brother. William stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. A brother. This has to be a mistake. It's not a mistake, William. His name is Malik. He's 6 years old, and his father was. Margaret hesitated before finishing. David. At the mention of the name, William's face hardened. David, the man you loved before I was born. Margaret nodded. Yes, I never knew he had another child. But the test proves it. Malik is your brother. William ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair. This is unbelievable. Why am I only finding out about this now? Tanya, Malik's mother, never knew her father. Her mother kept it a secret from her. She only recently learned the truth, and when I met Malik, I knew there was something familiar about him. William remained silent for a long time. Margaret could see the conflict in his eyes. Finally, he let out a deep sigh. I don't know what to say, Mom. This is a lot to take in. Margaret reached for his hand. I know, sweetheart, but Malik is just a little boy. He deserves to know his brother. Will you meet him? William hesitated, then slowly nodded. "I'll meet him."